Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I like speaking to groups, however small, who are intensely engaged in questions like this. Now, what I'm going to do is something I don't normally do. I'm going to actually read this paper. I don't like when lecturers read papers, but I have so much to get to that I tend to talk too much, and if I don't stick to the paper, I'll be stepping on other people's toes and going over into the other segments. So if this is a little dry because I'm reading it, I apologize, but better this so that we at least get to all the things that we need to get to. And I'm going to lay this out in three broad ways. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what I believe is the intellectual and the ideological background that gave an opportunity for the carnage that occurred in the 20th century, which has to be one of the bloodiest centuries, if not the bloodiest century in the history of the human race. So some of that intellectual content or ideological content. Then I'm going to draw a lot on my book on the Catholic Martyrs of the 20th century and just try to give you some examples of what happened. Because even if you think you know what happened, you don't know what happened. When I began to read into this, it was utterly shocking to me. I wrote this book, I gave a copy of the book to John Paul, now St. John Paul II, on May 7, 2000. That was the commemoration of all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century in the Colosseum outdoors. It was a very moving event. And it was deliberately crafted by John Paul II to make it clear that as we moved into the third Christian millennium, that these witnesses shouldn't be forgotten. So I'm going to get the background, then I want to get some of the empirical data of what happened in many countries. And then finally, I want to return at the end with just a very brief reflection on the lesson. I'm glad that Phil put the term lessons into the title of this conference, because there are many lessons that can be learned from the last century, and it's very clear that we didn't learn them, that it continues on. Now, to begin with, let me start with a personal anecdote. When my book came out in January of 2000, I called up the editor of the Washington Post Book World. I'd done a few book reviews for them, and I knew her. She was kind of favorably disposed toward the kinds of things that I did. And I said to her, look, this may sound like this is a Catholic book, the Catholic Martyrs of the 20th century. But in fact, this is a book about a neglected part of the secular history of the 20th century. This isn't only for Catholics. This just tells us something about the century that's just passed that not everybody knows about. We know about the Shoah, you know, the murder of millions of Jews in Auschwitz. We know about other atrocities, but there's been no systematic attempt to point out what happened to Catholics during the 20th century and why. So she assigned it to a young woman, a very intelligent, very well-educated in the normal way in America these days of being well-educated woman, who didn't much like what she read in my book. And in fact, in the review that appeared in the Washington Post, she said, Royal just doesn't understand that Catholics happen to be in the wrong countries in the 20th century. Now, if you want a first lesson, all right, here's a lesson that people cannot believe that wholesale slaughters could take place, which they did in dozens of countries in the 20th century, specifically against religion. I think the average, well-educated person, and I say again, the woman who wrote this review was a well-educated gal. She teaches at Duke, by the way, now. And she just I think she just said to herself, well, look, nobody takes religion all that seriously in the modern world. Who's going to start killing hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people because of their religion? And she just couldn't believe it. So I think the very first lesson to learn from this history is that there is there's almost a will not to know. But the lesson to learn is that there was there are some things people don't want to know about the century that just passed because it's outside their normal human experience. They can't understand how anybody would do things. And yet, in every year in the 20th century, there were Christians and Catholics killed, not simply because they were in the wrong countries, but because there was an animus against religion, particularly strong traditional religion that doesn't just go along with whatever else happens to be happening in the society. There's also an attempt to turn what were martyrdoms into mere political casualties. This too, I think, is just, the history simply doesn't bear it out. That if you look at what happened in countries as diverse as Mexico, I'll get to Mexico. Mexico had large numbers of martyrs in that we think of as a Catholic country. Mexico, Spain, Nazi Germany, Russia, China, Romania, Albania, many other countries around the world. There's a sort of a common element here that is anti-Christian, anti-religious to begin with, but more specifically anti-Christian because Christianity is historically the religion of the West, and it's important to realize that. Now, as I'm sure many people in this room know, Henri de Lubac, one of the great French theologians of the 20th century, wrote a kind of a famous book, or at least it was famous at one point, maybe a little less so now, called The Drama of Atheist Humanism. Now, as I was putting these remarks together, I was surprised to learn that de Lubac published this book in 1944. It was even before we knew the extent of the horrors of the Second World War, and certainly we didn't know yet the Gulag that Solzhenitsyn was to reveal later, and many things that happened afterward. But de Lubac, who was a prolific genius, already had a grip on what he knew was a kind of an intellectual construct that was going to make it possible for people to murder religious believers and think that they were serving humanity by doing so. And in fact, he talked about there being several different types of an anti-human humanism that because I think it's worthwhile to have these three particular types of anti-human humanism. You know, humanism that said we will get to human happiness and total freedom by way of a considerable amount of unhappiness and unfreedom. That was typically the way these humanisms would present themselves, because you had to present what you were doing as something that ultimately was going to lead to a great good, even if in the meantime there were high body counts and there was suffering in the society. Now, de Lubac rightly pointed out in the intellectual background of what happened in the 20th century that there were great names, Marx, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, even figures like Kant and a few others. But he says this, and I'm quoting here, the negation which underlies positivist humanism, which is kind of what we have in the West, Marxist humanism, and Nietzschean humanism is not so much atheism, in the strict view of the word, as anti-theism. In other words, not simply unbelief, but opposition to theism, anti-theism, or more properly, anti-Christianism. Great as the contrast is between them, their common foundation in the rejection of God is matched by certain similarity in results, the chief of which is the annihilation of the human person. Now, if you're a reader, you know Gentes and Massonis. If you look back at the history of the 20th century and try to account for what happened, he said it was a distorted idea of the human person. That the human person could be gathered into a collective, as happened in many communist countries, or the human being was a radically autonomous being, as kind of has happened in our country, and then many places in between those two extremes. De Lubac saw, by contrast, Dostoevsky, who, after his great conversion during his prison experience, realized that the supposed liberation of man, spiritual and social, was actually leading to a bondage in the spirit and socially. Tuvok observes, and I'll just end of observations. This is about Dostoevsky. He made one profoundly important social truth clear. Man cannot organize the world for himself without God. Without God, he can only organize the world against man. Exclusive humanism is inhuman humanism. The destiny of man being eternal, he is not meant to find ultimate repose here below. Now, this touches on deep theological points, right? That, as Solzhenitsyn said, and I guess we'll discuss with Dan Mahoney, that the line between good and evil passes through every human heart, and there's simply no way for human beings, flawed human beings, sinful human beings, imperfect human beings, to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps to liberation. And it's here that I'd like to tie in a bit with the commemoration that we are having yesterday and today about the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. Because as you all know, I'm sure, World War I was described as the war to end all wars. Now, simply in practical human terms, this is a pretty silly idea because no war is going to end war. It would be great if it did, but probably the only war that would end war would be an ultimate nuclear war, something that would wipe out all human beings, because while there are human beings, from Cain and Abel down to the latest things that happen in the world, human beings are human beings, and they're mixtures of good and evil. And that utopianism, that belief that somehow we can do it, it plays into a number of different currents that are scientific and social and whatnot, that believe that we are putting behind a kind of a superstition that itself allegedly led to violence and to repression, and we're now getting into the clear uplands of human liberty, the human race come of age, as Kant said. But the human race is pretty much always where it's been, and as some of my friends in Washington like to point out, it's like we all never left junior high school. It's how it often feels in Washington. Probably looks that way from where you are as well. But one of the things that World War I did, this has been analyzed by many scholars, is it really destroyed the confidence in some of the crucial human institutions. Country, there's just been this debate about nationalism and patriotism over in France, where Trump and Macron are going back and forth. But faith in country, because the country had misled many different peoples to fighting with one another to no apparent advantage to any of them. So country had disappeared, faith kind of was a casualty, culture was a casualty of World War I, even the family and the military. Because all those things seem to have been exploded as ideals that weren't really ideals. It's not that World War I itself was a nihilistic operation that then went on to create great slaughters in this ideological sense that I'm talking about. But it opened up the possibility. It let loose the devils, if you want to put it that way, that in the past were held back by national cultures and religion and the way families brought up people. And you start to see this in the sequel, after what some historians call the long weekend between World War I and World War II. When World War II starts, what emerges? There's a kind of a Nietzschean humanism in Germany. Now, there's a big debate in Germany about whether Nietzsche was ever an anti-Semite. It appears that he wasn't. But he certainly was a kind of an apostle of the blonde beast, is what he said. That kind of Aryan, military figure who was admirable in some ways if he was chivalrous, but if he was not chivalrous, a monster. And so clearly the desire to be hard, to be successful, to win at battle was something that came out of Nietzsche. And we see that taking flesh very clearly in German Nazism. There's also a kind of a Darwinian element underneath all of this, because it was believed that the Aryan race was the master race, that biologically, with this phony science, biologically, the Aryan race was the master race, that nature itself had designated to be dominant in the world. The problem with this view is I always think of the remark of one of the great Orthodox and later after conversion Catholic theologians, Vladimir Soloviev, who said the whole problem with Darwinism for people who want to be a moral people is that Darwinism tells us we are all descended from apes. Therefore, let us love one another. You see the problem, right? And it's no accident that when you turn then from Nazi humanism, you turn to Marxist humanism, which is scientific socialism. Again, a false science of, not this time, not the person and not the race, but of society. You start to hear Marxists use terms like the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Now, when you hear the term dictatorship of the proletariat, or at least when we Catholics hear the term, we can't help but also think of Cardinal Ratzinger's famous phrase, the dictatorship of relativism, right? And there's something that's similar in both of them. It shows that there's a kind of an incoherence, a desire to make something into a moral category that in fact it can't be. So if there's a dictatorship of the proletariat, who is the proletariat ruling over? Is it ruling over itself? Is it ruling over the elites? That doesn't seem to point in the right direction. When Ratzinger speaks about the dictatorship of relativism, can relativism without any values be a dictatorship? Well, apparently it can, because in a way it pulverizes all those real human institutions, the real humanism that enriches human life and instead destroys the things that make human life possible. Now, our Western radical autonomy is Ratzinger has also talked about that. He talks about it in terms of positivism, which is another kind of scientific view. It's a mixture of philosophy and science that when the universe seems to present us with no hard and fast natural rules, when there isn't a God that reveals to us the way he wants us to live, then we take our own positive steps to create our own meanings of the universe. And as was famously said by a kind of Supreme Court Justice, Anthony Kennedy, in the Casey decision, I'm sure you're all familiar with that phrase of his, that one of the fundamental foundations of liberty is your right to define your own meaning of the universe. And I think we've been doing that, and it's an utter disaster in this country. So anyway, this is just a very brief overview of the three types of inhuman humanisms that you see in various parts of the world in the 20th century. And I want to turn now to that second part of my lecture, where we see some of the actual ways that this played out in different countries, countries that you probably also wouldn't have expected them to. Can the kind of socialistic move toward temporary unfreedom ever lead to freedom is the question that I would put out there. And I think we see from the 20th century that it never does. And I want to start in Mexico. Now, almost anybody who would just cast an eye at Mexico would assume that Mexico was a Catholic country, that it would not be the kind of place that Christian martyrdom would occur in. But in fact, it was one of the earliest places where these sort of ideological humanisms began to take hold and to actually produce large body counts inside the country. At the time of the Mexican Revolution, which is in the 19-teens, they started to import some socialist ideas and some anti-clerical and even anti-religious ideas into the country. And as a result, Mexico murdered thousands, priests, nuns, laymen and lay women. It outlawed the Mass at certain times, closed seminaries, drove bishops out of the country. At one point, I think all the Mexican bishops were living here in the United States in the late teens, if I have this right. And the excuse, as always with secular systems, secular socialist type systems, is that the people had to be freed from superstition and backwardness and ignorance and the repression that Christianity had brought to them. And the irony in this, of course, is that many of the people who were saying this were educated in Catholic schools, sent their kids to Catholic schools, even as all this repression was going on, and were actually misrepresenting the history of Mexico. The University of Mexico City was founded 85 years before Harvard by the Church and the Crown in Mexico City. You can believe that. So what happens? We get the Cristero Rebellion, sometimes called the Cristiada in Mexico, which ends up being a war between Christians who wanted to defend themselves and this anti-clerical, anti-religious government. 300,000 people died. And that's in warfare. That isn't even counting the people who were arrested and executed as opponents of the regime. Both the Vatican and the Mexican bishops did not want violence used, force used, to respond to the repression that the Mexican government was visiting on its people at that time. But in one of what I think is one of the great lay moments in the 20th century, one maybe that we ought to take as an inspiration for ourselves, the lay men and women in the Cristiada told the bishops, this isn't a religious matter. This is a matter of our religious liberty in the secular sphere, and we'll handle this. You don't have to get involved in it. So they did. If you haven't seen Andy Garcia's film For Greater Glory, it's about this period, and it's quite a fascinating adventure, but it also lays out very, very clearly the kinds of violence that the government visited against various Catholics during that time. And it went on well into the 30s and even beyond. If you've read Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory about that priest who's being pursued, that gives you a good sense of the feeling in Mexico at the time. And Evelyn Waugh wrote a book called Mexico, an Object Lesson, which with Waugh's usual savage irony really brings to the surface some of the things that were happening. Now, I can't leave Mexico without mentioning Blessed Miguel Agustin Pro. If any of you know Pro, was a martyr. Pro is a very interesting figure. The most famous thing, of course, that happened to him is that the Mexican president, Plutarco Calles, arrested him and then invited the world press to come and watch him be executed, thinking that this priest, who was just a humble priest, would break down, would show that he was a coward, and that when he died in a cowardly fashion, they would be able to spin. So it was one of the first uses of the idea of spin. They would be able to spin to the whole world this idea that priests and nuns and bishops and whatnot really were not deeply committed to their faith, deeply confident in their faith, and that when they were put under pressure, they would crack. Well, what happened actually was Pro went to the wall where he was shot, held out his arms and said very calmly, not defiantly, not timidly, but he said very calmly, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. So he was shot, and pictures and films of this went all over the world. It backfired, as spin always should, but it usually doesn't. But in this one particular case, the Pro case, it actually helped the Christian cause. But I want to just, as a sidebar, tell you what I think is one of the funniest stories in all the stories I read about writing those 400 pages about the Catholic martyrs. Pro was a real cut-up. And in fact, some of his seminary buddies said that if you had asked them who was likely to become a saint in the seminary class, Pro was at the bottom of the list because he was always doing practical jokes and he'd be tossing buns in the cafeteria and whatnot. But he was an actor and he was a musician, and he would take on various roles actually when he was a priest in Mexico. When he came back and he was illegally a priest because the Mass had been banned, the churches were closed, etc. So what they did is they set up confession stations and communion stations. There would be a house like this, and the priest would come in and distribute communion or hear confessions, but it wasn't in a church. So one day, Pro comes to a private house, and he sees two plainclothes policemen outside the house. So he was told by his superiors, don't be reckless, because the people need you. If you get caught and you get killed, then there are no priests. But if you're not brave and you don't show up when you say you're going to show up, then they win. Then the people will not come any longer. So he sees the two plainclothes police, and he walks up, pretending, kind of swaggering like he's a lieutenant of police, and he flips his lapel as if he has a badge under there. Of course, there's nothing under there. And he says, "What's up, men?" And they say, "We think there are two pigeons inside," meaning priests. He says, "Really?" "Yes." He says, "Stay here, I'll investigate." So he goes in, he distributes communion. This is a true story. He comes back out, and they look at him and they say, "Well?" He says, "False alarm. Carry on, men." This is the kind of heroism and self-possession that you find a lot of times in these martyr stories. Quite interesting, anyway. Let's move on to another secular situation. Again, a country that many people would think of as Catholic, and I mean Spain. Now, just this past weekend, 16 priests and religious were beatified in the Sagrada Familia church in Barcelona. They were all killed during the Spanish Civil War, which went from 1936 to 1939. But they were hardly unusual, because the anti-clerical and outright communist elements in Spain, I mean, now we're moving from just kind of a vague socialism to a really much stronger pro-Soviet socialism. When the Civil War broke out, Spain sent its entire, all the gold in its treasury to the Soviet Union for safekeeping. This is how close the elements were there. Now, what you usually hear about the Spanish Civil War, it's these nice democratic Republicans versus these awful fascists with General Franco. Franco was not a fascist. He was not an ideologue of any kind. He was just called back from Africa when things started to get out of hand in Spain. And actually, within the first 6 months of the Spanish Civil War, he kind of stabilized most situations. So the real fighting, the widespread fighting, occurred in only 6 months in Spain. Okay. When I went to the Commission of New Martyrs in 1999 to look through their files, because John Paul II had asked the dioceses from various parts of the world to send in their dossiers about martyrs, and they were all assembled. You know the Tiber Island in Rome? There's St. Bartholomew Church there. It's near the old Jewish ghetto. In the basement of that church was where the Commission for New Martyrs met, and they had 13,000 files by 1999. 9,000 of them were from Spain. Now, it's not that Spain was particularly high in the body count. It just happened that it was in Europe. The repression was relatively short, those 6 months I was talking about. And people kept records, kept very good records of who was lost. And in Spain, you kind of don't count martyrs, one here, another one there, somebody like Pro here. They're whole monasteries, whole convents, whole seminaries, whole religious orders. So the 9,000 might actually be a low count. But given that this was a country that kept records, we have a fairly good record of what happened, and it's horrible. And you start to see an almost diabolical, rather than just violent, but a truly diabolical element that starts to come out of this, because there are blasphemies, there are altars that are fouled with horse dung and all sorts of other things. The bodies of nuns and priests being dug up and then used for target practice. Some really awful things begin to happen in Spain. In one place during the war, priests were so hated with one part of the army that they would put priests in the corrida, the bull ring, with bulls. And you know how in bullfighting, when you kill a bull, you cut its ear off and it's a souvenir. Well, in this case, when the priests were killed, they cut the priest's ear off and they would So this was quite nasty stuff. And I want to say again, you can read into this material and get a very false impression from many of the sources that you're likely to come across. If you look even at George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, for example, he's honest about what happened in Spain. He knew that he was fighting for the Republicans as a type of socialist, but he knew that there were atrocities against the church. If you read Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls, he knows it too. And in the movie version, actually, it's portrayed rather strongly. But there were many others who didn't follow it. Jacques Maritain, very intelligent man. Francois Mauriac, a brilliant novelist. They were all on the side of the Republicans, thinking that what was happening was an emergence of democracy in Spain, when in fact it was a republicanism that kind of hid a type of socialist tyranny underneath the surface of being democratic. It's worth digging into. It's a very interesting story. 13 bishops died in Spain. We all hear in English-speaking countries how priests and religious in places like Mexico and Latin America and Spain are lazy and they're not really committed to the faith. But I can say from my reading of these two areas, there are very few who did not stay faithful, and right to the point of death. When you have 13 bishops in a country like Spain who were willing to stay, they could have fled to other European countries, but they stayed and they died. This is a witness that is worth paying attention to, and a lesson, because it reverses something that we're normally inclined to think is different. Now, when I wrote my book, I got a lot of criticism because people said that I was focusing on the casualties in countries like Mexico and Spain that were produced by socialist or communist type regimes, and I was neglecting the way that national security states in Central America, Argentina, Chile, etc., produced, I think we can say, some martyrs of their own. I was in Rome a few weeks ago when Oscar Romero was canonized, and I think it was right that he was canonized. But I gave dozens of talks at the time, and I just said this: look, it's true that in any given country around the world, if it gets into trouble, it will begin to try to repress the other side, sometimes in violent ways. And so Romero, the Jesuits in Central America, the American churchwomen who were killed in Central America, people in other countries, in Spanish-speaking countries, sure, we can look at this and say, there's something here that also needs to be paid attention to. But it's nothing compared to the scale that these more ideological regimes carried out. Industrial level killing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. In the case of the Soviets in China, probably millions of people murdered because as religious believers, they were an obstacle to a government. So I want to make it clear, I'm not overlooking that element as well. And I have a chapter in my book about Romero and about some of the Central American martyrs. But simple justice, I only had 400 pages to write this in. Simple justice is we have to pay attention to where the largest body counts were, and the largest body counts are due to ideologies. Now, I want to point out, because of this complexity, just one element that John Paul II introduced to this whole conversation about martyrs. I mentioned I went to the Commission on New Martyrs. That doesn't only mean recent martyrs. John Paul II recognized that because of the nature of the modern world, there are cases like these political cases that also involve some political element, but that was always the case in Western history. Nero, Marcus Aurelius, Decius, Diocletian all carried out repression of Christians, and it wasn't because of a theological dispute. It was because they thought of Christianity as a socially disruptive feature in ancient Rome. And in a way it is. One of the bishops, Bishop Walsh, who went to China, once said that Christianity is like dynamite. So if you put it out there in society, there are going to be explosions. And that's one of the reasons why you see a pushback against a real Christianity that has something to say in the public realm. But this extends to even other types of martyrs. In my book, I talk about a Sicilian priest, Pino Puglisi is his name, who was killed by the mafia because he was trying to protect the people in his parish and the surrounding parishes. And the mafia didn't like the fact, I think there was a dispute over who was going to control water and waste management, as they still have a problem in southern Italy with. And he was assassinated by the mob. Now you could just call this a mafia hit, but both Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have called Puglisi a martyr, precisely because in his desire as a priest with a certain understanding of human nature and of human society, he chose to put himself on the line, as Romero did, in a tough political or social circumstance, and died as a result. So there's a kind of a newness to some of the modern martyrs that it's worth paying attention to, that enriches our idea of what happened in the 20th century. Okay, so we've seen what happened in places like Mexico and like Spain, two Catholic countries. So I want to turn now to some of the places where we had some of the more extensive slaughters. And I really want to begin with Nazi Germany. We tend to forget that Nazism is National Socialism, that in fact it too has a type of ideological, political element, not just a racial element, a scientific element, but has a political ideological element based on race, but that affirms a certain people as being dominant, that Darwinism that I talked about earlier. It's an absurd racial science, of course, but nonetheless, it's, you know, it was there. What that led to in a place like Germany is quite incredible, because we Catholics probably are used to hearing that the popes did very little during World War II to protect Jews. This was not true, by the way. There were lots of Catholics who took risks to protect Jews, lots of failures in protecting them too, but lots who did protect them. The Nazis used the post-World War I sentiment of defeat to I think, convey this absurd racial science to the people as a whole. I don't think the Germans bought this idea generally, but it was a good way for them to affirm that this is something that we can do to restore our lost self-respect. There was tremendous pushback among the churches. There was the confessing church among the evangelicals. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a member of that. We know, for example, of Cardinal Clemens August von Galen, the Lion of Munster, who was a very strong critic of the Nazi regime. He did not become a martyr, although he spoke out a lot, but plenty of other people were. And if you begin to dig into the records of what happened in Nazi Germany, the place that the Nazis liked to send religious figures they were trying to repress was Dachau. For some reason, and this happened in other countries, it happened in the Soviet Union, it happened in China, happened in Vietnam. The totalitarians understood that you need to keep the religious people basically in one place, because if you spread them out in the different camps, they start to make converts. So if you keep them all in one place, at least the infection stays only in one place and doesn't become multiple and even a more difficult problem. There are many priests who were rounded up in Nazi Germany. According to the records, at least about 2,600 priests were rounded up at one point in Dachau alone. 300 or 400 others died in transportation, which means they probably were taken out and shot. I myself looked at the record of the records from that whole period, and my estimation is this: there were roughly 18,000 priests in Germany in 1933 when the Nazis took over. And by the end of the war, at least 1/3, and we have records that you can go to, at least 1/3 of them were arrested, executed, hassled, intimidated. So when you hear that the church did nothing or did not stand up, I can document 1/3 of the priests in that country at that time. There is a written record. Germans are good for keeping records, by the way. or there's a written record of what happened to these people, and quite often it led to death. About 2,000 Polish priests ended up in those Nazi camps. And Poland is the country, since Poland is sort of on the border of East and West, it's one of those countries that you begin to see how 20th century totalitarianism works no matter where it is. So the Nazis go in and they pick up 2,000 priests, and among them the famous Maximilian Kolbe, for example. Edith Stein dies in Auschwitz also. But when the Soviets come in, as the Soviets begin to push back the Nazis, they start to do the exact same thing. In fact, we tend to think of the Nazi Germany as creating the concentration camp idea. It's the Soviets who begin to create this large-scale modern invention known as the concentration camp or the work camp, what later we learned to call the Gulag. We only learned about it later, but it was actually the model for the Lager in Germany and for the Laogai in China and other places like that. The Russians are fond of telling us Americans that they lost 20 million people in World War II, and that's probably true. But they don't tell you as often that they put 19 million of their own people into these prison camps, which very often were slave labor camps. You worked people to death, and that instead of executing them, you kind of got some socialist value out of them, and they died doing some labor for the regime. The repression could be so hilarious in places. I was telling, my wife's an icon painter, and I was telling her last night before I left, because I was reading back through my book, in Poland in the 1950s and 60s, Cardinal Wyszynski decided that he would have a 9-year novena to prepare for the third Christian millennium. And Wyszynski was the one who said to John Paul II when he was elected, "You will lead the church into the third Christian millennium," which is why I think John Paul II was so sensitive to that point of transition in 2000. Well, Wyszynski sent the Black Madonna. I don't know if you know the Black Madonna, but it's an icon. It's kind of darkened, which is why they call it the Black Madonna. He sent it in a tour around Poland, and Polish Catholics, being enthusiastic the way they were, they would turn out in huge numbers to see this. So it got to the point that the communists couldn't tolerate this anymore, so they arrested the icon. This is true. They arrested the icon, they put it in storage somewhere, and so Wyszynski, who was a tough Polak, didn't give up. He sent the frame around to various places in Poland. That sort of thing happened in the Soviet Union as well. There was a strong desire to resist, and people actually risked their lives to continue doing what they wanted to do. It was in Poland that the communists came up with another idea. They invented the prison camp, as I mentioned, but they also came up with the idea of the patriotic church, which we still use that term, of course. In China, just this past weekend, there were 4 priests who were arrested in China, and a bishop who I think has been arrested 5 times was arrested yet again for re-education. Re-education, of course, is the term of art that the Chinese use when they try to brainwash somebody. And these patriotic churches, it's very clear, are an effort to take what is an independent religious element in society, one that stands up for true humanism and stands up against a false sense of what a society is, and therefore cannot be allowed to have any public presence. That public presence is just a standing rebuke to totalitarian regimes. In Russia, the Orthodox Church suffered even more than the Catholics, simply because there were more Orthodox in Russia than there were Catholics. And yet, this is probably something very few people know unless you do a specialized study. In 1934, there were 3,300 Catholic churches in Russia, because there were a lot of Poles, there were a lot of Germans, other nationalities who were Catholic. They were not Orthodox, and they would set up different churches. There were 3,300 churches and 2,000 chapels. And then once the Stalinist repression of religion really got going, there were two left. There was one church in Moscow, the St. Louis Church, that was run by a brilliant French Assumptionist, Father Neveu. And there was another church in St. Petersburg that was left open. These were sort of Potemkin churches so that they could give the impression that there was still religious liberty in a place like the Soviet Union, but in fact they were the two exceptions to what had otherwise been a fairly large Christian community, Catholic community in the Soviet Union. Now the Russians came in and they also pioneered the idea of taking over schools and seminaries and hospitals and publishing houses and newspapers, so that you essentially squashed the entire presence of religion in the public square as a whole. I think it's a great shame that except for specific studies, almost no one paid any attention to this. A very good book came out just before my own in about 1999, 1998 from France. It's called The Black Book of Communism. It's really worth looking at if you've never seen this. And it's a compendium by 4 French scholars who go back and look at communism all over the world, because there are still communist regimes, more or less communist regimes in Cuba and Vietnam, and whatever North Korea is kind of officially communist, and China and whatnot. But in this very well done scholarly survey of what happened in the 20th century, the repression of religion there's one paragraph. I was reading through it. It's a big, thick book. I was reading through it looking for that. There's only one paragraph. And this is the reason, if we want a lesson to be pulled out of this history, it's that we have to make sure that people are aware of the fact that this is the kind of thing that happened in the 20th century and I think we start to see it creeping in our own societies, the way that, for example, Obamacare began to step on the little sisters of the poor. The way the U.S. government has got to force the little sisters of the poor to pay for possibly abortifacients and contraceptives. It's not necessary. It's the kind of thing that a modern society, modern nation states tend to want to expand into all realms and take control of all realms. And as we're starting to see, the positivistic science in our own so-called free West has resulted in how many abortions? Probably over 1 billion around the world. Certainly 50 million, 60 million here in the United States. This too is part of the carnage that has come out of this ideology in the 20th century that we need to reckon with as well. Now, I'm tempted, after laying out these large-scale slaughters, to talk a little bit about the truly sadistic and satanic persecutions that took place in places like Albania and Romania. I have chapters about this in my book. But I've given a lot of talks on this, and I've started to feel that it's a bit of persecution porn if I really go into the details, because it's really, it's diabolical stuff. I mean, the mildest thing that you will see in there is a priest is forced to dress up in a clown costume and sweep the streets and be abused. But there are some pretty nasty scientific experiments that go on too. I'll just mention one, the Pitești experiment in Romania. Took seminarians, young seminarians and young priests who were very eager in their religion, and tried to, by a kind of operant conditioning, associate in their minds disgusting things like feces and dead bodies with their religious beliefs, in the hope that maybe this was a way that they could scientifically break the hold that religion had on certain people. It's so horrifying a record. This is even worse than the Mengele stuff, because that was partly so-called scientific research. This is pure sadism. But if you want a lesson, another lesson from the 20th century, I'll just mention that it's there. And if you've got a strong stomach, you you can take a look at it. Now, some of you may be surprised that I haven't mentioned Muslim persecution of Christians. And as hard as this is to believe, in 1999 when I was writing that book, it almost didn't exist. I've got a chapter on Charles de Foucault. I don't know if any of you know him. He was a French nobleman who actually became a kind of a lone missionary in North Africa, a very successful, very holy guy who eventually was killed by the Berbers in what's now, I think, Algeria. And it is a very interesting figure. But other than him, there's little. We have the Trappists from Tiberine in the late 1990s. There's a very good movie about them, which I forget the name of right now. Of Gods and Men, thank you. And I really would suggest watching that because it gives you a sense of what those people were like. They knew that they were in great trouble because of the agitation of the Muslims in Algeria in that period. But I want to say again, in the late 1990s, Muslim murder of Christians almost unheard of. And in less than 20 years, it's one of the first things that we hear about, and maybe secondarily a place like China with the kinds of repression that exists there. Now, I can't help mentioning one connection that I have to a Muslim murder. My friend Don Briel, I think some of you probably knew Don Briel, who was one of the great and now late proponents of Catholic studies in Catholic universities in the United States. Don was flying back from France after a meeting about Catholic higher education, and he picked up a copy of Paris Match that had a story about the assassination and martyrdom of a priest, an Italian priest in Turkey called Andrea Santoro. And the journalist from Paris Match went to Santoro's room in Trebizond in Turkey. And he looked around and he said it was all very neat, almost a little obsessive. It was like one of these neat priests who had his slippers under the bed and whatnot. And he said, but there was one ominous sign. On the bedside next to his bed was a copy of the Italian translation of Robert Royal's The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. So Don saw this and said it to me, and I wrote him back, and it goes on, you know, it goes on. But let me conclude. I'm going too long probably already anyway. I gave scores of lectures on this material in the early years of the 21st century, not only in the United States, but in several other countries. And after all those presentations, there's only one question that I was ever asked that stood with me in a very prominent way. A young woman got up after one of these lectures and she said to me, weren't you depressed writing this? You know, getting up day after day for a whole year. It took about a whole year to write that book. And just, you know, reading about murders and strangulations and people having their throats cut and ripped limb to limb and, you know, on and on and on. And I told her it had never crossed my mind. That I'd never spent such concentrated time with so many good, heroic, and saintly people. People who not only died calmly like Christians, but also died like Jesus, asking forgiveness for the very people who were about to kill them. So, I think that there's a reason why John Paul II wanted us to recuperate the memory of these witnesses. We'll never know them all. Solzhenitsyn says there are hundreds of thousands who died in the Gulag with a tag on their toe with a number. We'll never know who they all are. But this is what John Paul II said in Tertio Millennio Adveniente, which is at the beginning of as we're getting toward the third Christian millennium, to people like us as we entered into the third millennium. He said, at the end of the second millennium, the church has once again become a church of martyrs. The witness to Christ born even to the shedding of blood has become a common inheritance of Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, and Protestants. This witness must not be forgotten. And I think it's precisely because this is maybe where it is the clearest how real Christian faith and real Christian courage can stand up. They're admirable in themselves, but they also witness against the very thing that targeted them, the thing in the 20th century and that still continues in our 21st century that targeted them. It's a matter of justice, of course, to go back and remember this carnage, that we remember these people and we recognize them as we would, say, people who died in the Shoah or in any other injustice in the 20th century. But these martyrs are also valuable witnesses. And therefore, there's a final lesson, I think, here to us about what happened in the past. That's an important lesson to learn, and it's, as I said at the very beginning, part of the lesson is that no one wants to learn this lesson. They're a warning about the present, because we see those same creeping totalitarian elements, maybe not quite as openly in our Western societies as elsewhere, but the kind of radical autonomy that's detached from any true value in God or in nature. We see this in the transgender movement. We see it in a variety of other ways. That, too, is becoming very militant and in a way could become as dangerous as the totalitarianisms of the past. But finally, these witnesses are a guide and a lesson for the future. Because the diabolical forces unleashed by false humanisms and utopian ideologies have not gone away. And I think it's one of the tasks that this Center for Restoring Christian Culture could undertake, to help us recuperate that witness, those lessons, and to use them in the public square to make sure that our future is not as dark in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century. Thank you. Any questions, comments? If you may have a comment, make it brief, please.
You mentioned the Vendée or kind of France and that sort of proto-socialist lineage.
Yeah, there's a long history behind the 20th century martyrdoms. The Vendée is, you all know what the Vendée is. It was the one area in France that really heroically resisted the anti-clerical elements in the French Revolution, and therefore was the site of hundreds of thousands, 200,000 or 300,000 people, I think, were killed in the Vendée. It's not surprising. It's not surprising that once you kind of drop the Christian and the solid humanist tradition that we got out of ancient Greece and Rome, once that begins to disappear, the more vicious, and I would say at times the more demonic side of human beings is going to come forward. And so the natural human propensity to anger and to fury gets magnified where all those things are absent. And I also think that, by the way, since utopias can never be created, some of the great frustration we see, even in our own countries right now, stems from the fact that people think the world ought to be perfect. They don't realize that the public sphere is somewhat like a family. If you threw everybody in your family out who is not perfect, everybody would be out, including you yourself, right? So there's a kind of a political prudence. There's a kind of a political moderation that you don't. I live in Washington, so these are hard days to talk about moderation. But there's a kind of moderation in human interactions that is very important. And these absolute drives toward human liberation and utopia, they're going to produce disasters like that. But that's a precursor. There's no question.
Right.
It's a great precursor. Lila, yeah.
Do you think that the phenomenon of the ideological attack on religion
Yeah, I mean, you could keep writing books about martyrs, couldn't you? And I had to restrict the countries that I could touch on because there are truly vast numbers of stories that are out there. The question of Islam is a hard one because Islam is by nature, as you know, a religion that's intertwined with a politics and a kind of an ideology. It isn't necessarily the case with every totalitarianism. Although, you know, there are movements in Nazism to kind of recreate Christianity. I have that in the paper. I ended up not reading it for I don't know why, but there was Aryan Christianity. You know, there was Aryan Christianity in which Jesus was sort of a soldier, and he was. By the way, they also were able to figure out somehow that he was not Jewish. This is what ideologies will do with. But I don't know about Islam. You know, for a while, Christians and Muslims could live reasonably well together. You know, but there's something else that's going on. Something else has gotten into the mix that we can't entirely see at this point. I don't know. I mean, I know people who think that because Islam comes after Christianity, it has to be a heresy and a diabolical deviation from what God wanted. That could be true, but I don't know that that's the most, it's the best explanation of what's going on. It seems to me that there could have been ways of coexistence, and there were in some places for a while.
Do you speak about Our Lady of Fatima at all in your book, in her warning about following the errors of Russia? And also, would you speak a little bit about China and the situation of the church in China at this point?
Right. Yeah, I do mention Fatima. Fatima is one of my great devotions these days. I don't know why. It didn't really grab me when I was writing the book, but as we got nearer the 100th anniversary of Fatima, I was in Fatima the week before the 100th anniversary because I was coming back from something else in Europe. And I think it really explains much of the 20th century. You know, those little kids in Fatima is still out of the way in a country that's kind of on the edge of Europe. It's more modern because there are hotels for pilgrims and restaurants for pilgrims, but it's still out of the way. And those children were so far removed from the center of European culture in those days that when the lady said to them, and they didn't know the lady was the Virgin Mary initially either, when the lady said to them that Russia would spread her errors to the world, they thought that Russia was a woman. She was a bad woman. You know, they didn't go study geography or history, that's what they thought. But if you look at Fatima, it really, as very few apparitions do, it really did point toward the immediate historical future. I mean, 2 world wars, the man in white almost killed the Pope. Pope John Paul II was very proud of the connection with Fatima, and my book was translated into Portuguese, and I gave a presentation of it in Lisbon in about 2003, and the Portuguese who are still Catholic, and there are a lot of them, they're just convinced that they were central to, in at least this way, to what happened in the 20th century. But about China, very quickly, I should let Phil talk about this probably because he knows more about it than I do. But I'm just mystified by this agreement that the Vatican has signed with the communist Chinese, because we know what the communists are like. You know, you sign an agreement with them, the next week they destroy 2 chapels, then there are 4 priests picked up. And I've met with some of these Chinese officials who handle religion in Washington, because they visit, they come over. And they are the slimiest, slipperiest liars you have ever met in your life. You know, you tell them a specific instance and they say, oh, that was just a local official. He didn't. Yeah, but it did, you know, and you explain, and they have an answer for everything that is utterly unconvincing. And it's not surprising. They don't believe in truth the way that we do. They believe in the power of the regime that they're putting together, their own kind of communist system. And they paid very careful attention to what happened in Poland and what happened in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, when religion, joined of course with other secular forces, actually exploded communism in Central and Eastern Europe. So they've decided that's not going to happen where they are. I don't know why the Vatican felt obliged to sign an agreement with them. I think these things would have gone on anyway, with or without an agreement. So I don't know what, I know what the advantage was for them. I don't know what the advantage was for us. I was over at the Synod for the Family. I'm sorry, the Synod for Young People just last month, and 2 Chinese bishops were sent by the Chinese. The Pope didn't invite, he had to invite them because they can only participate if the Pope invites them. And China just told the Vatican, it appears, these 2 guys are coming. So the Pope invited them so they could participate. And a week after they had been in Rome, they said, oh, we have other commitments. We have to go back to China. And one of the guys is a member of the Chinese Communist Politburo. You know, he's actually a member of the ruling circle in China. So it's a, you know, Vladimir Bukovsky always used to talk about the DNA of communism, that it's the same in a way in Cuba as it is in Sandinista Nicaragua, as it is in China, as it is in Romania, etc. My dissertation advisor at Catholic U many years ago, Virgil Nemoyano, who's retired now, is a Romanian who escaped from Romania, communist Romania. And he was the Secretary General of the World Comparative Literature Association, which is the umbrella group for the discipline that my PhD is in. And he was going to China for their annual meeting. They had the meeting in China that year in Peking. And he got back and he said to me, I was in a cab going from the airport to downtown Beijing, and he said, something felt funny. And I looked out the window and he said, it looked exactly like Bucharest. It was the international communist style that the buildings even had there. So there's a, you know, we tend to, as Americans, we tend to neglect that there are these ideologies, you know, that spawn different formations, social formations, but they're there and they continue on. I was in Cuba when John Paul II was there. It's the most repressive country I'd ever been. I mean, and open about it. They'd have agents filming you on the top of the rooftop across the street from your hotel, watching you go in and out. No attempt to hide it. It was all, you know. So anyway, let's hope that that the Vatican will gain some advantage from this arrangement with the Chinese, but I don't expect that it's going to be much of anything. Okay.
Well, you've been moving gradually to the right as you speak. It's something that happens to people in my presence. And I'm afraid this is going to fall off. We can. Our second speaker, Amy Fahey, I hinted earlier today, for those of you who are clever enough to have picked up the hint that she had not been a friend of mine for 35 years. I meant that as no slight. She has become a good friend, but 35 years ago, I'm not sure she was alive. Amy Fahey holds a doctorate in English and American Literature from Washington University in St. Louis, where she was the recipient of a 4-year Olin Fellowship. A Rhodes Scholar semifinalist, she received a BA in English from Hillsdale College and an MPhil in medieval literature from the University of St. Andrews. She was awarded a Weaver Fellowship for Graduate Studies and an Earhart Fellowship for work on her dissertation in Heralds and Heraldry in English Literature, 1350 to 1600. In addition to editing several book manuscripts, Dr. Fahey has served as managing editor of the journal Faith and Reason, has directed numerous conferences for the Liberty Fund, and was director of academic development for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Before coming to Thomas More College, she taught courses at Washington University and Christendom College. Her teaching interests include Anglo-Saxon and medieval literature, the modern short story, and poetic form. Her most impressive achievement is as a homeschooling mother of 5 children and wife of Thomas More College president, Dr. William Fahey, Amy Fahey.
Thank you, Phil. By a strange paradox, the tragedy of the war seems to be producing the lovely miracle of a renaissance of faith. The clear notes of the Sanctus bell sound above the roar of the guns. Through the smoke and dust of battle shines the sanctuary lamp, and by new and bloody paths, the world comes again upon the old road to paradise. Those are the words of Joyce Kilmer, the subject of my talk today. And my intention today is to share with you, or introduce to you, what I think is the largely unknown but incredibly moving story of the life and career of Joyce Kilmer, to reintroduce him to a Catholic reading public and to rehabilitate his legacy from those who have over the past decades scorned and dismissed him, to, if you will, promote his cause, both to defend his literary method and to raise acknowledgement of his profound sanctity. And these pictures that I have of Kilmer, I didn't produce. I gave a talk on Kilmer on the 100th anniversary of his death, July 31st, 2018, at the Knights of Columbus Museum. He was a Knight of Columbus, and so the Knights, as part of their series of lectures on World War II, and they have a special exhibit on World War II going on, had a talk on Kilmer, and they produced these photos of him, which they kindly said I could reuse. When Kilmer was killed in France by a sniper's bullet just over 100 years ago, and just 4 months before the war ended, the nation mourned the loss of the most popular Catholic poet, writer, and lecturer then living, the, quote, Catholic laureate of America, as many called him. The tributes from his contemporaries were heartfelt and prolific. Quote, 10 times thrice happy is he, rarest of men, who, like Kilmer, never penned a line or said a word or did a deed that can arise to bring confusion to those who love him. The Literary Digest, of which he had once been the poetry editor, said, quote, the world is the poorer for the loss of a very gallant gentleman and a poet who never wrote a line that was not pure and sweet and clean. Nearly a decade after his death, his friend and fellow journalist Charles Willis Thompson declared in the pages of the New York Times, for which Kilmer had been a regular columnist, quote, he has taken his place in literature and history. Everything connected with him becomes not only of interest, but essential to the understanding of him. Writing over a generation later, a columnist in Columbia magazine declared that, quote, Joyce Kilmer has enshrined his name in the hearts of his countrymen. His life has served as an inspiration for millions of young Americans. Writer Catherine Bergy said of his war poems shortly after his death, quote, all are expressions of something beautiful. All stand an excellent chance of being read a century after the war is over. And in some corners, that's still the case. So yesterday, for instance, the Archbishop for the military, they had a special mass that the Knights of Columbus had organized in Washington, D.C., and some of Kilmer's war poems were actually set to music. And earlier in the summer in France, near the battlefield where Kilmer and 6,000 other Americans are buried, there was a special meeting of French and American divisions that had served in the campaign that he lost his life in, and the American commander actually read his poem, Prayer of a Soldier in France. Are any of you familiar with this poem? Anyone? My shoulders ache beneath my pack, lie easier cross upon his back. I march with feet that burn and smart, tread, holy feet, upon my heart. Men shout at me who may not speak, they scourged thy back and smote thy cheek. I may not lift a hand to clear my eyes of salty drops that sear. Then shall my fickle soul forget the agony of bloody sweat? My rifle hand is stiff and numb, from thy pierced palm red rivers come. Lord, thou didst suffer more for me than all the hosts of land and sea. So let me render back again this millionth of thy gift. Amen. It's amazing to think that the American commander in France was reading that poem just a few short months ago. When I first began researching the life and career of Joyce Kilmer, it was by one of these happy accidents. I got a message from Joseph Pierce saying, the Knights of Columbus would like someone to give a talk on Joyce Kilmer. Do you know of anybody? And at the time, I knew about as much as some of you might have known about Joyce Kilmer. Maybe I was a little ahead of the game. I knew that Joyce was a he. Like Evelyn Waugh, he's borne the fate of being mistaken for a female on many occasions. Just a couple days ago, a homeschooling friend of mine emailed me and said, I didn't know until just now when I was looking up Joyce Kilmer, because my daughter's memorizing trees, that he was a man. I knew he was American. Some people thought he was British. And I knew that he was Catholic because I had seen the anthology of poetry, Joyce Kilmer's anthology of Catholic poetry. That was sort of the standard, even decades after his death, the standard sort of anthology of Catholic poetry. But I didn't know about his amazing life, his amazing faith, and the 5 principles that this center is promoting. Joyce Kilmer embodied all of them. And since the governing theme of today's talks is lessons from the carnage, I'm going to ask what lessons, what carnage? Because I think that Kilmer lived, wrote, and died keenly aware of and engaged in battling cultural and spiritual threats which extended beyond the battlefield. As he said in his final public lecture, which was an address to the graduating class of a now defunct Jesuit college, Campion College, out in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and he was very close. He said he was an adopted son of Campion College because he was very close to the Jesuits there. He said, quote, in a sense, all of you will go forth to battle against our nation's foes, although you never carry a rifle. For the forces of materialism, spiritual indifference, cynicism, are more formidable than any blast of shell or shrapnel, more terrible than an army with battles. And so I'd like to suggest that the chief quiet battle that Kilmer fought, and one which he continues to fight beyond the grave, is a battle for the integrity of language, if you will, and for the leavening role of poetry in popular culture. Kilmer's friend and colleague, Robert Cortez Holliday, who put out a 2-volume collected set of Kilmer's works shortly after his death, says that there are 3 words that characterize and frequently appear in Kilmer's writings. These words are democracy, faith, and mirth. And I'd like to demonstrate that these qualities of democracy, faith, and mirth were the governing principles of his brief but beautiful life. But they were also the operative principles of his literary career, and they define him fundamentally as a poet of democracy, a poet of faith, and a poet of mirth. Needless to say, Kilmer's commitment to the common man, to Roman Catholicism, and to cheerfulness have not earned him any friends in the halls of higher learning since his death, where materialism, spiritual indifferentism, cynicism, and worse are actively promoted. The Philalexian Society of his alma mater, Columbia, of which Kilmer had served as president during his time there, annually honors Kilmer each year by hosting the Joyce Kilmer Bad Poetry Contest, in which students try to outdo each other in composing and reciting pretty vile, blasphemous, and sexually explicit poetry. It's really awful stuff. It's not fun. There might be 1 or 2 fun ones, but I have looked at, they post all of the contributions online, and I would advise that you not look at it, but I did, out of interest, take a look at it and was a little bit appalled to see how his legacy has been treated by his alma mater. Now, I don't wish to suggest that Kilmer was a great poet. he wasn't. But he was a good poet. And he was in his day, and well beyond, an immensely popular poet. And he quite intentionally wrote commonplace poetry for common people. And it is safe to suggest that in the intervening century, popular poetry has all but disappeared. Kilmer knew that he was a pretty mediocre poet, and he didn't care. Quote, "The Catholic faith is such a thing that I would rather write moderately well about it than magnificently well about anything else." Now, Kilmer was born in 1886, so he was writing his first volume of poetry, Trees and Other Poems, came out in 1914. And so he was writing at a time where he could have very easily gone in a different literary direction, like so many of his contemporaries. And if you take a look at his letters, which I have done, before his conversion in 1913, it will give you a good sense of what is in the literary air at the time. He writes of dining out at fashionable New York restaurants like Petit Pas with the leading actors, painters, playwrights, and poets of his day. And it's very interesting. I just sort of took out a cross-section of things that he's reading or that he's recommending, just to give you a sense of the cultural moment in which he begins his career. In 1909, he writes to his mother, and it's sort of neat to think, wow, wouldn't it be nice to say, oh, this new book is out, and have it be one of these? I bought a new book by Kenneth Grahame called The Wind in the Willows. And that same year, he says, I'm translating a Russian play, The Cherry Garden, with a friend of mine who's an exiled revolutionist. Now, this is 1909. Chekhov dies in 1904. It's the cherry orchard, as we come to know it. And I don't think that translation project ever materialized, because I don't think it was produced until well after the war. On an English or American stage. I could be mistaken about that. In 1911, he writes to his mother, do you hear much of Ezra Pound's work in England? He's a young American poet, resident in London. I've read his two books, which have made some sensation over here. So again, this is well before the publication of the cantos. These are the early poetry of Ezra Pound. In 1912, by all means, read Chesterton's latest novel, Man Alive. It's a very delightful book. You remember those essays of Chesterton I got you recently, don't you? So it's very interesting to think about this cross-section. You know, Kenneth Grahame and Chesterton and Chekhov and Ezra Pound. And it's interesting to think that in some ways, all of these works, in very diverse ways, articulate a deep human need for a sense of place, of community, of identity, in a world grown increasingly spiritually, economically, and culturally confused. Kilmer also has, his last published book was a work called Literature in the Making by Some of Its Makers, and it was published in 1917, shortly before he deployed for France. By Harper's, and it's a series of interviews that he had conducted with leading literary figures of his day. They were first published in the New York Times, where he was a regular columnist, and then they were compiled in this collection, this book collection. And it's a really interesting cross-section. I would probably say I hadn't heard about I've never heard of about half of them. Some of them are not even on Wikipedia, interestingly. But among the other half, Booth Tarkington, what must have been a very elderly John Burroughs, Amy Lowell. It's a really interesting mix, William Dean Howells. So again, Kilmer sort of stands at a kind of cultural crossroads for America and for poetry in this country and in Europe. And I want to take a look at those three elements, democracy, faith, and mirth, and kind of unpack for you both his cultural contribution, but also aspects of his life. So I don't want to sort of march through a strict biography. I kind of want to get at it by his own account and the account of others about him and his involvement in the war. So, democracy. Kilmer understood democracy in the best sense of the word, not some radical abstract egalitarianism that would abolish all distinctions, but an equality derived from each individual's dignity and preciousness in the eyes of a loving God, and a faith in and love for common, ordinary people engaged in simple, ordinary pursuits. He chiefly articulated this sense of individual worth in his poems about people. Dave Lilly, the fisherman, the servant girl and grocer boy, the man who runs the deli. In The Snowman in the Yard, Kilmer contrasts his chaotic, unkempt house full of children playing in the snow with that of his wealthy neighbors, whose home is manicured, spacious, prosperous, and empty. But I have something no architect or gardener ever made, a thing that is shaped by the busy touch of little mittened hands. And the judge would give up his lonely estate where the level snow is laid, for the tiny house with the trampled yard, the yard where the snowman stands. Perhaps this championing of the ordinary little guy is nowhere best expressed than in a poem entitled Delicatessen. And this poem, the genesis of this poem was he was having an argument with one of his office mates, and his office mate was saying, there are some just inherently poetic subjects. Not everything is poetical. And Joyce Kilmer was saying, well, if you look at it the right way, anything can be poetical. And he said, well, not really. What about that deli that we go to for lunch? He said, well, I could write a poem about that. And so he did. And it's called Delicatessen. And it's basically a beautiful paean to the small business owner. He decks his window artfully. This is just the ending portion. He haggles over paltry sums. In this strange field his war must be, and by such blows his triumph comes. The man has home and child and wife and battle set for every day. This man has God and love of life. These stand, all else shall pass away. O carpenter of Nazareth, whose mother was a village maid, shall we, thy children, blow our breath in scorn on any humble trade? Have pity on our foolishness, and give us eyes that we may see, beneath the shopman's clumsy dress, the splendor of humanity. So, Kilmer loved the splendor of humanity. He loved all people. His mother, in her memoir of him, I don't know if she's... I have to take her at her word, but she says that he hated cruelty in all its forms. He never told a lie. He was a very cheerful, good man. And he initially was very opposed to the war and to America getting involved in the war. He had certain pacifist tendencies, but all of that changed on May 7th, 1915, with the sinking of the Lusitania and with the loss of innocent human civilian life that happened when the Germans sank that ship. And he wrote a poem called The White Ships and the Red to express his indignation at that event. And in that, there are white ships who've perished throughout history, through war or through accident. There's a Spanish galleon, the Titanic, and they meet this innocent red ship whose demise was calculated and intentional. But never crushing iceberg, nor honest shot of ice, nor hidden reef has sent me the way that I must go, nor shot of honest foe, nor hidden reef has sent me the way that I must go. My wound that stains the waters, my blood that is like flame, bear witness to a loathly deed, a deed without a name. My wrong cries out for vengeance. The blow that sent me here was aimed in hell. My dying scream has reached Jehovah's ear. So this event and the writing of the poem marked a turning point for Kilmer. And when America joined the war, he quickly signed up, even though he was a married man at the time. He had 4 children and another on the way. And this is something I think we could talk about in the question and answer, or you could ponder why he had every reason not to fight in the war. He wasn't required to do that because of his family situation and his age. But he did, and his Jesuit priest friend, Father Daly, who was also a fellow poet, tried to persuade him not to. And he convinced Father Daly that this is what he needed to do, that he couldn't go back to his office every single day and look himself in the mirror, knowing that that other men were fighting for his wife, for his children, and for their freedoms, and that this was something that he felt compelled to do. And it made me think of, you probably heard of the recent death of the Brent Taylor, the mayor of North Ogden, Utah, who was killed, who was a National Guard reservist, father of 7, between the ages of 11 months and 13. And when I read the comments of his wife on her husband's sacrifice, it really reminded me of Kilmer's situation and the words of his own wife after his passing. When he joined the war, he never wanted to rise above the rank of sergeant. It was part of his sort of democratic spirit. He insisted, he tried so hard to get into a particular regiment, the Fighting 69th. And that was because it was Irish, and at that time he had become a Catholic, and it was full of ordinary Irish boys, and he wanted to sing ballads late in the evening with his Irish comrades. But he also just was very committed. He said, I'd rather be a sergeant in the 69th than an officer in any other regiment. And, you know, of course, Joyce Kilmer signs up, and you know, everybody wants him to be protected. He's going to be the literary man that's going to chronicle the war, and he wants to see action. He wants to fight for his country. He doesn't want a desk job. He wants to be in the thick of things, and so he's very insistent on that. And he also had a firm belief, idealistic, some might say, in the justice of their cause. He says that an invaded nation is always right. He writes to his wife in May of 2018, just a couple months before he's killed, "We are peacemakers, we soldiers of the 69th. We are risking our lives to bring back peace to the simple, generous, gay, pious people of France. They are an invaded people, and invaded people are always right. The careful study of certain ghostly villages, I cannot forget them, has taught me where I would have stood in the 60s, and that is on the side of the invaded southern states. God keep me from ever being ordered to take part in an invasion of a peaceful land." And it's very interesting, when I gave the talk at the Knights of Columbus Museum, there was a representative of the 69th, a retired colonel of the 69th, who had come, and the regiment still has the crucifix that Kilmer was wearing when he was killed. And he was a sergeant, but interestingly, that crucifix has been passed on from commander to commander of the regiment. And until very recently, every commander of the regiment wore that crucifix and wore it into battle. Most recently, when the 69th self-deployed after 9/11 in New York, the commander, Colonel Shine, had it in his pocket. And now it's sort of deteriorated such that they say that because they don't want it to deteriorate anymore, they're keeping it in a box. But I think it's unfortunate that, but also very beautiful that until recently it was worn by all the commanders. So a recent poetic tribute that came out just after Kilmer died by a contemporary, Helen Gray Cone. So, you know, there's so many of these popular poets that have fallen into obscurity, but she chronicles how he was understood as a poet of the people. He chose to walk in the main street in the wide ways of men. He set wings to the common things with the kind touch of his pen. He caught the lilt of the old tune that the hearts of the plain folk beat. He might have dreamed on the far faint hills, but he walked on Main Street. And in one of the, I came across this, one of these New York Times articles, when he's interviewing these contemporary figures. You can kind of see where he stands on things. It's not the interviewer's job to intrude his own views necessarily when he's conducting an interview, but there are certain telltale signs by which we can read Kilmer's views. So when he's interviewing Amy Lowell, for instance, who he elsewhere, you can tell is not, I don't know how many of you know of Amy Lowell or her poetry, but he considers her one of these proponents of free verse and a kind of innovator and one who's sort of taking down the traditional standards of poetry. And she says in her interview, he says, one objection that many critics bring up against free verse is that it cannot be remembered. And she says, I cannot see that that is of the slightest importance. The music that we whistle when we come out of the theater is not the greatest music we have heard. Zacchaeus, he did climb a tree his Lord to see, is easily remembered, but I refuse to think that it is great poetry. So he has this sort of recognition that there's a kind of aristocratic scorn for common poetry amongst these practitioners of the new poetry. But in one of his interviews, he interviews this woman, Josephine Preston Peabody, who was the wife of a Harvard professor of engineering. And the title of the article is Free Verse Hampers Poets and is Undemocratic. So it's a little bit telling. But what she says reminds me so much of Kilmer's poetry, and I can't help just quoting a couple of paragraphs of it. The practitioners of free verse are organized into a cult that denies other freedoms to other poets. And I object to the bigotry of some of the people who are trying to impose free verse upon an uninterested world. And I also object to the unfairness of some of the advocates of free verse. When they compare free verse and what I suppose I must call chained verse, they take the greatest example of unrhymed poetry that they can find, the King James Version of the Book of Job, for instance, and say this is better than Yankee Doodle. Therefore, free verse is better than traditional verse. You see, the commonest thing there is, I may say the most democratic thing, is the rhythm of the heartbeat. A true poet cannot ignore this. At the greatest times in his life, when he is filled with joy or despair, or when he has a sense of portent, man is aware of his heart, of its beat, of its recurrent tick-tick. I thought of the first line of Shakespeare's sonnet, when I do count the clock that tells the time. He is aware of the rhythm of life. When we are dying, perhaps the only sense that remains with us is the sense of rhythm, the feeling that the grains of sand are running, running, running out. The pulse beat is a tremendous thing. It is the basis of all that men have in common. All life is locked up in its regularly recurrent rhythms, and it is that rhythm that appears in our love songs, our war songs, in all the poetry of the human cycle from lullabies to funeral chants. In the great moments of life, men feel that they must be sharing, that they must have something in common with other men. And so their emotions crystallize into the ritual of rhythm, which is the most democratic thing that there is. So in addition to this wonderfully democratic spirit, as I've defined it, as Kilmer defined it, Kilmer's life and career was also defined by his faith. The faith was central to and inseparable from his vocation as a poet, and it was at the heart of his decision to become a soldier. He was born and raised an Episcopalian, and for a time in his youth, he flirted with socialism. He was a wild revolutionary, and when he married his wife, Aileen, she had to pray in secret because he would not allow her to pray. And then, after the birth of his second child, he had his oldest son, Kenton, and then his daughter, Rose. His daughter was struck with infant paralysis. And he used to stop in, he worked in New York, at the Church of the Holy Innocents. And he began a correspondence with this Jesuit poet, Father Daly. And he says, just off Broadway on the way from the Hudson Tube Station to the Times Building, there's a church called the Church of the Holy Innocents. Since it is in the heart of the Tenderloin, this name is strangely appropriate, for there surely is need of youth and innocence. Well, every morning for months, I stopped on my way to the office and prayed in this church for faith. When faith did come, it came, I think, by way of my little paralyzed daughter. Her lifeless hands led me, I think her tiny feet still know beautiful paths. You understand this. And so he began corresponding frequently with Father Daly. He began taking instruction from a local Paulist priest, and both he and his wife entered the church in November of 1913. And just a few weeks after his conversion, he writes to Father Daly, you will be glad to hear of our Christmas present from Sœur Therese. Rose can lift her left forearm. I know that you have been getting her aid for us. Please tell us how to show our gratitude to her and to you. So, and it's just, again, one of these beautiful cultural moments to think of Kilmer asking this priest to intercede with Therese of the Little Flower at this time, when she's, obviously not canonized until the following summer. And his daughter Rose died just at the age of 5, just about a week before his deployment, and before his final son, Christopher, was born. And he wrote to Father Daly, there was a mission in our parish church just a couple of blocks from the house, and while Rose died, the voices of the sisters singing O Salutaris Hostia could be heard in the room. Certainly Rose makes heaven dearer to us. And in his final letter it's to a sister of St. Joseph who taught in Toronto, Sister Mary Emerencia. He writes, pray that I may love God more. It seems to me that if I can learn to love God more passionately, more constantly, without distractions, that absolutely nothing else can matter. Except when I'm in the trenches, I receive Holy Communion every morning, so it ought to be all the easier for me to attain this object of my prayers. I got faith, by praying for it. I hope to get love the same way. And after Kilmer died, there was a beautiful memorial mass for him in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And his mother, who was not Catholic, but who was very supportive of his conversion, says, it will always remain with me as a beatific vision. It seemed as though the great Catholic Church opened her arms wide and said, quote, all this pomp and splendor I gladly give to dear Joyce Kilmer, who found his greatest comfort in his brief life with me. So the third quality that I want to enumerate that is part of his, and all of these qualities, obviously, his belief in democracy, his deep faith, and his mirth are intertwined, but is his mirth. And Kilmer was overwhelmingly described by everyone who knew him, from his wife to his co-workers to his comrades in the war, as a really indefatigably cheerful, sanguine guy. Robert Cortez Holliday, who wrote an eloquent memoir of his friend, and who was not himself Catholic, says that he was so unlike all other young men anyone had ever seen walking about, so much brighter and purer, or some indescribable thing, that he did not seem altogether real. And I loved reading his letters. His letters are so cheerful, and they put me in mind of the famous letters of another poet, John Keats. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of the letters of Keats, but Lionel Trilling in his introduction reminds us that Eliot thought of them as the best letters, the greatest letters by any English poet. And he describes what he considers the chief quality of Keats as geniality. And I would say that Kilmer has that same quality of geniality, that same zest, that love for life, but it's even better because his cheerfulness is animated by his Catholic faith. And I have these great pictures. There's a great description, physical description of him by one of his contemporaries. His eyes were his most remarkable feature. They were of the unusual color of red, and they had a most peculiar quality which I can only inadequately suggest by saying that they literally glowed. It actually seemed as if there were a fire behind them, not a leaping and hissing fire, but a steady and unquenchable flame, which appeared to suffuse the whole eyeball with a brooding light. Oh, to have such an eye. Although I have to say, I think that I don't know, the author of that particular description, I don't accuse him of plagiarism, but it reminded me of the description Sir Walter Scott gives of when he meets the poet Robert Burns for the first time. He says, "The eye alone indicated the poetical character and temperament. It was large and of a dark cast and literally glowed when he spoke with feeling or interest. I never saw such another eye in a human head, though I have seen the most distinguished men of my time." So I don't know if it's just that there is something called the poetical eye that both Robert Burns and Joyce Kilmer shared. But really, Kilmer is kind of like Innocent Smith. And all of the descriptions of him, if you know this character from Chesterton's Man Alive. There's an episode early after his conversion. He took the train every day and he wrote poems about taking the train. He loved taking the train because it brought him home. And while he was traveling home one time, he mistakenly, in his zeal, dashed in front of a moving train. And he was dragged a considerable distance and rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital in Suffern, New York. And he had multiple injuries, he had fractured ribs. He entered into the spirit of the experience with much relish. It isn't every day that one gets hit by a train, nor everybody that gets ribs broken. Exhilarating kind of thing when you see it that way. Kilmer says his friend Cortez found it, quote, "an exhilarating thing to be at the mercy of circumstances over which you had no control." I find it terrifying sometimes to be at the mercy of circumstances over which I have no control. And he writes to Father Daly, "I've been very comfortable in a delightful hospital run by particularly amiable Sisters of Charity." He continues by relating that he had received the Blessed Sacrament right before the accident. "To this fact I attribute my escape from death, since at the place where I was struck, several men have been killed." Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Father Duffy. Father Duffy is like the most decorated military chaplain. There's a statue of Father Duffy in New York. And he was the chaplain of the 69th of Kilmer's regiment. And he loved Kilmer dearly. When Kilmer was killed, he read out Kilmer's poem, Rouge Bouquet, and all of the men of his division were weeping profusely. They loved Kilmer, and Father Daly loved Kilmer. And he says of Kilmer, "There was something of what the Scots call Fahey about him as a soldier. He was absolutely the coolest and most indifferent man in the face of danger I have ever seen. It was not for lack of love of life, for he enjoyed his life as a soldier. His only cross was his distance from home. It was partly from his inborn courage and devotion. He would not stint his sacrifice. Partly his deep and real belief that what God wills is best." So I don't know, you've probably all heard of Baden-Powell, who started the Boy Scouts, and he wrote a little book called Quick Training for War after the British entered the conflict. And he enumerates the 4 C's of the qualities that every soldier should have. And these are courage, common sense, cunning, and the last, which of course Kilmer possessed enormously, cheerfulness. Quote, "It must be remembered that war is not what the picture books would have us believe, a continuous succession of glorious battles. But it is much more like a dreary succession of days and weeks of hard and apparently aimless marching, dull, dreary tramping in great herds under heavy loads, utterly fagged and weary, without excitement, without hope. That utter weariness of body and soul which make men quite resigned to being shot. But here it is that a few cheery spirits exercise a vitalizing influence and are worth the presence of hundreds of extra men to their force. To show courage and fortitude with a smiling face, even in the most hopeless and depressing circumstances, is a God-sent gift. And Kilmer possessed this gift to a tremendous degree. All of his letters reveal it. He wasn't shielded from the horrors of the war by any means. Rouge Bouquet is the poem he wrote when almost 24 of his men are buried alive when their trench collapses on them, his close friends. He does shield his wife from these circumstances in his letters, but he was fully aware and fully experienced the carnage of the war. But he writes to his wife, "There is to be an Homeric banquet at our house one day, the day when I exhibit to my comrades the glory of my life, yourself. You will like them all. Say a special prayer for them all. They're brave men in good and splendid company. Dangers shared together and hardships mutually borne develop in us a sort of friendship I never knew in civilian life, a friendship clean of jealousy and gossip and envy and suspicion, a fine, hearty, roaring, mirthful sort of thing, like an open fire of whole pine trees in a giant's castle." And one of his final letters, written to his mother just before his death, "I am glad that from you I have inherited the power of readily escaping from worry and work and entering with enthusiasm into whatever mirth I find around me, in finding good and true and merry friends everywhere." And when I read about Kilmer's merry disposition, his mirth, even in his final moments, I'm reminded of our college's patron, Thomas More, and his letters to his daughter, that we may merrily meet in heaven again. I think they're not unconnected. Now, I'm just going to spend a few minutes, because I know we're very conscious of time, but I did mention that the carnage Kilmer is fighting is a kind of battle against the fragmentation of culture, and in particular the fragmentation of poetry. And he's often charged with being, for those who even bother to read him or know anything of him, overly sentimental, insipid, saccharine, Hallmark cardish. And I'd like to defend Kilmer briefly against this charge that he's simply writing sentimental verse. So when used as a pejorative to critique poetry, for instance, to call a poem sentimental means not only that the subject matter is prompted by feelings of tenderness, nostalgia, or sadness, but that these feelings are somehow shallow, exaggerated, self-indulgent. The intensity of the emotion, in other words, is excessive and disproportionate. Sentimentality, with its emphasis on emotions, can often operate independently of rationality. And when sentiments operate outside of the Christian faith, as we see in our contemporary understanding, for instance, of a word like compassion and the misuse of this word, compassion, it can be incredibly horrific. As Flannery O'Connor reminds us, tenderness, when divorced from the source of tenderness, which is Christ, ends in terror. But Robert Cortez Holliday reminds us that Kilmer despised the febrile gush of emotion. Kilmer's verse is not irrational, it's not solipsistic, and I would suggest it's not disproportionate. It's uncomplicated, yes, and the feelings it celebrates, satisfaction in one's labor, joy in one's family and friends, sadness over the loss of a home, are ordinary feelings expressed in simple, if at times overly formulaic, ways. But this is part of why I would suggest that they became so popular and that they were able to lodge so successfully in the hearts and minds of everyday readers. And Kilmer repeatedly articulates and affirms this poetic view. It's not that he just was a bad poet and he never thought about poetry and that he just put pen to paper. He actually thought about it. And he very consciously wrote simple verse in an era that wasn't really championing simple verse. And he has a great little essay on the Catholic Belgian poets of his day. And he wrote great essays, I think, that are not well known on other poets, on Belloc, on Chesterton, on Father Gerard Hopkins, as he was being discovered. And Kilmer says of this Belgian Catholic poet Thomas Braun, he praises him in words that are just identical to those that could be applied to Kilmer's poetry. He has directness and sincerity. The quaintness of his poems is not an affectation. It is a quality proper to the work of a man who, like Wordsworth, sees beauty chiefly in simplicity. Like Coventry Patmore, he has divine frivolity. He is acquainted with the mirth of the saints. In his own beautiful words, he knows how to play in the straw with the child of Bethlehem. Still, I'm not under any illusion about Kilmer's weaknesses as a poet. He, favors strict iambic tetrameters, end stops, rhyming couplets. He uses adjectives in places like humaner and sacreder in a kind of pretty hokey fashion. And his desire to be democratic sometimes misses the mark, as in, I would say, this is one example. It's the final stanza of his poem, Main Street. God be thanked for the Milky Way that runs across the sky. That's the path that my feet would tread whenever I have to die. Some folks call it a silver sword and some a pearly crown, but the only thing I think it is Main Street, Heaven Town. So I really appreciate Kilmer's poetry when I read it in small doses or when my children are memorizing it. But if I had to listen to it constantly, I confess I would probably be like the narrator or the host in the Canterbury Tales when Chaucer, the pilgrim, offers his tale of Sir Topas, which is a sort of sing-songy romance, and at a certain point the narrator stops him and says unkind words about the form of the poetry and his rhyming. And certainly there's something about trees, and I love trees, in spite of its noble sentiments, and that does inspire parody. And I don't know if any of you have ever read, imitation is a form of flattery, but there's a couple of really witty parodies, and I think Kilmer would have loved them. This is the proper sort of parodying of a poet. Ogden Nash, his parody reads, and do all of you know this poem, Trees? I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. It's a lovely poem. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. I think that I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. Indeed, unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all. That's up there with Thomas Merton's parody, and in which he takes on the commercialization of Gethsemane, which at that time must not have been selling fruitcakes, but cheese, Trappist cheese. It is called cheese, and the S is a $sign. I think that we should never freeze such lively assets as our cheese. The sucker's hungry mouth is pressed against the cheese's caraway breast. Poems are not but warmed up breeze. Dollars are made by Trappist cheese. So I don't have time to make what is a bigger argument about Kilmer and poetics and what he's doing in his time period and what other poets are doing. If I had time, it would be something like a defense of the relationship between form and meaning in poetry, and the sort of decline of form as a symptom of something else that I think is almost more significant in poetry, which is the kind of growing inability, not on the part of poets necessarily, but just everyday people, in understanding or even conceiving a figurative language of positing relationships between things. I think that is a very real and grave problem for our humanity. And it's hard to fathom a world in which people can't posit likenesses between things, can't think figuratively at all. It's interesting, when we had a summer program of high school students, and part of it was they were exploring nature. And I asked all of them, to spend some time in nature. And I think one of the students is here, actually. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but to just come and share with the class something that they saw in nature that was like something else. And this was a very difficult exercise, I think, for most. And actually about half of the class came in and talked about trees and talked about how the limbs of the tree were like arms, and that one of them said there was a bare branch and it looked like a finger pointing to God. And this is, this is the basis of so much of our understanding, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray. And what we have in modern poetry, there's still, in Kilmer's day, there's still this understanding of figurative language, but the comparisons are all violent. They're all breaking the traditional metaphors. And of course, Eliot's patient etherized upon a table at the beginning of Prufrock is something that, I don't know if you know this poem by Chesterton. It's a great poem called To a Modern Poet, in which he takes on this. I am very unobservant. I cannot say I ever noticed that the pillar box was like a baby, skinned alive and screaming. I have not a poet's eye which can see beauty everywhere. Now you mention it, of course the sky is like a large mouth shown to a dentist, and I never noticed a little thing like that. So, Kilmer had incredible hope for American poetry, for European poetry. And he repeatedly says these outrageously optimistic statements. Here's just a couple of them. Quote, "The poets have seen and felt things mighty and terrible, and they can no longer concern themselves with erotic fancies and the nuances of their own emotions. In days to come, historians of literature will perhaps see that. On the thought of all Europe, this war has had a clarifying and strengthening effect. Good still comes from evil, sweetness from force, and honeycomb out of the lion's carcass." And he also says, "I hope that poetry is reflecting the virtues which are blossoming on the blood-soaked soil of this land," France. "Courage and self-abnegation and love and faith. This last not faith in some abstract goodness, but faith in God and his Son and the Holy Ghost, and in the church which God himself founded and still rules." And in his mother's memoir of him, there's only the copy that I have, which is an otherwise clean copy from UCLA library. There's one bit of marginalia someone has written in the margins, beside this comment. "I honestly think, although it may seem conceited to say so," and this is a letter to his mother, "when we soldiers get back from the war, we'll do the spiritual and intellectual life of the states a lot of good. France has taught us lessons of infinite value." And written in very fine fountain ink cursive on the side is simply the word rot. Rot. So we have to admit that Kilmer was in the main wrong, painfully wrong in these sanguine predictions. But as conservative Catholics, we're all too familiar with championing the lost cause. And so even though Kilmer was on the wrong side of poetic history, his instincts were good and right and true. And it is up to us to figure out what to do with Kilmer's hopeful vision for America, American culture, American poetry. Can popular poetry be renewed? Can the wounded surgeon ply his healing arts and resuscitate the etherized patient? And I want to, by way of answering this question, just share an email that I received after I published a little piece on Kilmer. And it's from a medical doctor. "My father, now 14 years in the grave, had a great love for Kilmer. This is much more of a tribute than you realize, since my father, thoroughly realistic and pragmatic, tone deaf, completely blind to art in all its many forms, once described as a cultural nothing by his siblings, had not a poetic bone in his body. Nevertheless, in the twilight of his 80 years, even with a memory impaired by normal pressure hydrocephalus, he could recite trees in full. Part of his love for Kilmer, I think, stemmed from his own service in the South Pacific during World War II, which seared and marked him in ways that those of us who have never been to war can only guess at. He was part of the occupation army of Japan after the war and visited both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I remember him describing for me, with just a barely observed hint of deeply suppressed horror, the shadows of human beings seared on buildings, the only legacy left of those who were vaporized by the nuclear blasts. We can perhaps hope that Kilmer someday might be elevated to the dignity of the altar. So I want to end because Kilmer once said, and this is rather bold of me, but it'll just take a couple seconds, and I appreciate your forbearance, that when he had a great idea, every idea became a lecture, an essay, and a poem. I'm not sure that's the way to write poetry, but I kind of took on the challenge since I wanted to just really partake of Kilmer's spirit. So I've written an essay and I gave a lecture, and now I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote on Kilmer. There are just a couple things I want to say before I read the poem, recite the poem. And I don't write poems very often, if at all. But I had a couple of things in mind when I wrote this poem, and I sent it after I wrote it to a fellow who's, I think, one of the greatest living American Catholic poets and commentators on poetics, James Matthew Wilson. And he said, interestingly, that I needed to make it just a little more regular, that I needed to push back a little harder against the fragmentation. But so the poem is in blank verse couplets. So it's couplets of unrhymed iambic pentameter, with the exception of a rhymed couplet at the beginning of the end that imitate the poetic form of Kilmer's trees. And the envoy at the end, the two lines at the end, are by Kilmer himself. So I'm just going to take a drink of water. The poem is called Testimony of a German Sniper for Joyce Kilmer, 1918-2018. I shot a man in France today. Now I am numb and cannot pray. We chose our weapons. Yours were mirth, delight, that grating goodness everyone adored. Mine, a Mausergewehr, 98. A single bullet straight through your sweet skull. What folly had brought us to this moment? And how was I to know what I had killed? The corner deli, Main Street, the snowman in the yard. You made it sound so simple, so pure, so lovely. Like a blue mantle gently shrouding a bent and wounded world. There was something insufferable in all that goodness, all that regularity of line and rhyme and rhythm, all that talk of the beauty of the ordinary. It made us despise you as everything too freely given, a dog's loyalty, a mother's love, God's mercy, is despised. It shined too bright our unbearable sin. We preferred the shattered line, the blank stare, the shaft of steel glinting in the hot sun. And what have you to show for it, all that quaint verse on hearth and home and faith and love? A legacy that chronicles defeat. A rest stop here, a mawkish bookmark there. See how a nation honors its fallen. See how Columbia mocks her laureate. But I am come through the wet, red forests of time to bear witness, we killed you. Or so I thought when my single bullet, precise, exact, direct, pierced your temple. But now you look at God all day, dead soldier, ora pro me. All evil things must harmlessly pass by, he who doth bear the talisman of mirth. Thank you.
much, Amy, for that great talk and for introducing me, at least, to the concept of the poetic eye, which I think is related to the editorial we, which, as you know, is spelled W-H-E-E. I'm very familiar with that. Thank you very much. We are going to take a break, and I hope you can all find something to eat and then rejoin us at, someone help me, please? 7:30 here, and do not forget the books that are on raffle back there, and I hope to see you again soon.